Welcome. Today I'm joined by Tom McTague of The Atlantic, author of the fantastic new profile of Boris Johnson in the latest issue of The Atlantic magazine summer issue. And I think, Tom, it's a welcome to reaction. It's headlined "Boris Johnson knows exactly what he's doing." And I think the first line is nothing can go wrong, which is a very Boris thing. Very Boris thing to say. It's highly unusual, isn't it, to get that much sustained access to Boris Johnson, to actually follow him around, go on trips with him, and you're trying to get to the heart of who he is and what he is as a politician.
Yeah, exactly. I've been working on this to get that level of access for about a year now. I think we started trying in 2020, and then obviously the pandemic happened, and they had a very reasonable point that, look, the time's not right. The time sort of never seemed to be right, actually, throughout that year. We would go back and we went through, I think it was the third director of communications that eventually we had to sort of put it to by the time we got the access that we wanted. So it was, it was a long drawn out process. But what was interesting, I thought, to me at least, was it was Boris Johnson himself who was the one who was attracted to it the most and sort of said yes. He was getting his directors of communications were skeptical. They thought, look, I work for an organization with a mainly American audience. It's quite a big risk for them to allow that level of access. Boris Johnson is not controllable. He could say anything. So they were skeptical, but it was Boris himself who said, no, let's go for it. And then, he seemed to actually forget that he'd given the go ahead when I went in to interview him. There's a bit in the piece where he says to his director of communications, what am I doing this for? Yeah. And he says, it's for the profile that I advised you not to do.
But so why do you think he originally did say yes? Is he bothered by how he's perceived? Does he care about it?
I think he cares about it. The more I read of what he'd written in the past, particularly this really interesting essay lecture that he gave about the Roman poet Horace, I think it was in 2005, and he talks there in a way that you just don't hear politicians talking in this manner. I think he talks about mortality and deathless fame, he called it. Where, essentially he's making this argument that journalists, historians, poets, they control how people are seen, and he's very aware of that. And I think what he's particularly aware of is that his reputation in the US is bad. His reputation in the US is linked so closely to Trump. In the eyes of both sides. But ultimately, I think, there is an element of snobbishness about Boris as well. He likes to be seen as somebody who's smart and who's not sort of lowbrow. And that is hurting him a bit in the US. So I think there is the ego, but there's also just the raw politics here. He knows he's got to have a good relationship with Joe Biden.
Yeah.
So, I'm perfectly aware that he was, he saw this as an opportunity as well. As ever in journalism, it's a two-way street. I'm offering something that he needs, and I need access to him.
Yeah. Do you think? I mean, he also, of course, has a problem within parts of the United Kingdom, doesn't he? That appeal that he has, and it is remarkable. He's a remarkable politician who seems. I know it's commonplace to say that he drives his opponents mad. I suppose all winners like Blair or Thatcher, to an extent, drive their opponents around the twist because their opponents can't quite work out how to find a way through. There's some connection that politician has forged with their electorate. But Boris's connection is a very English connection, isn't it? It's not Scottish, and it's certainly not Northern Ireland after the events the last couple of years. How does he? Did you talk to him at all about that? About him not being, in a sense, he's not a British politician, is he? He's an English phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, I asked him quite a few times whether how much this played on his mind. This was the biggest threat. He brought it up as well in conversations. I said, look, do you have this fear that you are going to be kind of the Lord North of the 21st century, the man who lost Britain, not just America, you know. And ultimately, I think he's completely aware that that would destroy everything, you know, everything that that his premiership is about. You know, there's an element to Johnson, I think, about him enjoying risk. And you know, I have this, you know, this sort of 5% of my brain thinks, does he want to have some kind of destructive moment? You know, there's a character in his novel which who talks about this, who he's just this bumbling Tory politician who cycles to work and gets himself in all kinds of scrapes. And in the dialogue that Johnson writes, this politician thinks aloud about, is he does he have a kind of death wish, or does he have a sort of, or is he just weak-willed? So I wonder whether, I mean, that's just Boris talking out loud essentially about himself. So sometimes I think that, but ultimately he does have this philosophy, and he said it to me, that he thinks that Brexit is not something that will pull the union apart, but will, over time, as long as you can weather this first storm, it binds it together, because you create something that's common throughout for England and Scotland and Wales. So, you know, crucially, not for Northern Ireland.
It's going to be interesting, isn't it, to see how, in terms of Scotland in particular, the forces, you can see the stuff that's happening on a pretty much weekly basis in the EU. The latest stuff on vetoes on foreign policy, and the attempts to get around the European Union's, you know, problems with Hungary, and so the kind of the attempts to expand the remit of the EU, plus the sort of hard border question in terms of Scotland. I suppose the hope of the Brexiteers is that over the course of 5, 10, 20 years, it becomes apparent to Scottish voters that Brexit has actually made full Scottish independence more difficult, or whether that's just outweighed by dislike of Westminster and Boris Johnson and maybe his successor. It's interesting when you're talking there about what he about his potential death wish. I always think that it's fascinating to observe how he responded when he was in situations back sort of 10 years ago, where he did stuff that would, or even longer ago, that would blow up a normal politician. And you think of the famous zip wire situation, or some of the "Have I Got News for You" stuff. It was almost as though, in a childlike way, he was realizing, my goodness, he could get away with other stuff, in a highly controlled, mediated political discourse, where it was the era of the thick of it, where everything was measured in terms of gaffes and small mistakes that could be the undoing of a politician. And here was one politician that, no matter what he did, it didn't seem to harm him. And to the contrary, and actually people seemed to love it. Why is it that his fans really, really like Boris? Is it because he's a kind of anti-politician?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is fascinating. I mean, I think partly it's luck, you know, that this man who has developed this skill from a very, very early age. You know, you read the biographies of him, and there are funny stories of him, you know, in school at Eton, making the entire you know, school fall about laughing because he's forgetting his lines, and he's pinning lines up on columns to do this performance. And it's the same thing that he's done throughout his life. So he's adept at that performance. But that, I think, his luck is that the performance fits the moment. I think, and as you were saying, you have these sort of hyper controlled politicians who present themselves as kind of perfect everyday men, like Tony Blair and David Cameron, super slick. You know, what was it that Blair said? You know, I'm just an ordinary guy. I'm just a decent guy. And you kind of, you sense that the public is getting sick of that, or sees the inauthenticity about it. And along comes this man who leans into his flaws. And that is something that I saw when I was following about, that it became noticeable when you saw him, say, in Northern Ireland, and then in Hartlepool, Sedgefield, and in Wolverhampton. He would take the perception that you would think of as a weakness, lean right into it. So on the tram, the scene that I opened the piece with, you know, he's in the tram and he's saying, nothing could go wrong. What could possibly go wrong with me in the driver's seat? You know, for a politician, a prime minister is supposed to exude competence. You know, there's no other politician who would do that. When he goes to play football with these players in Hartlepool, he leans not just into his incompetence as a footballer and his past kind of sort of absurd shows where he's tripping into people and injuring them, that are all over YouTube and have this sort of cult following.
That's where he trips and falls into the into another player. I actually always thought it was deliberate. I thought it was an attempt to bring rugby into football. But I don't know.
Yes.
He says it was an accident, does he?
I mean, I think so, because he gets up and he's sort of, oh no, what have I done? And the crowd start to cheer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he talks about this in Hartlepool. Oh, what, you know, my epic humiliation, another chapter in my epic humiliation. But then he also plays up his eliteness. You know, he sort of says, oh, I don't know anything about football. I'm better with an oval shaped ball, or I'm very good at the wall game. You know, and these kids, you know, they're 15-year-olds from Hartlepool. I'd be surprised if they knew what the wall game was.
Yeah.
I mean, why would they? But they laughed. They saw what he was doing. They understood it, and they liked it. And the rest of the trip in Hartlepool, he was greeted as this kind of lovable, patriotic celebrity, forgetting when his child's birthday was. And well, I spoke to Edmund Fawcett, his uncle, who's a journalist, a liberal journalist, and he said, look, that ability to sort of just put people at ease, to lower the standards in the room so people don't feel stuffy and they don't feel like they are uncomfortable with this sort of aristocratic, quite sort of intelligent presence, aristocratic as they would see it, you know, certainly elite Eton background. Johnson just gets rid of all that immediately, and I was really taken with how good he was in these small groups of people. You know, he always started with a joke and they always laughed, and then he was off. And it was, you know, on a pure sort of politician skill level, I thought it was different from what I'd seen with Blair and Cameron. I mean, Brown and Theresa May were just awful, but you know, Blair and Cameron were impressive. But Boris is something different.
What about people who don't sort of laugh and smile when they see Boris? And there's a strong strand of opinion, isn't there, that actually just can't stand him. Is clearly in a minority and has as yet no political outlet or rallying point. What do you think it is about him and his approach and his record that does mean that he is so hated by that group of people who can't stand Boris?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I've heard from a few people that he really dislikes it if you don't laugh and you don't find him funny. And what I notice as well, he looks around the room. So when he's cracking jokes, he's kind of looking for affirmation. He weighs people up. I saw him often looking over at me, writing things down when he was talking to people, as if he's sort of checking to see what I'm finding noteworthy about.
I love that bit when he said, "You're collecting color, aren't you, Tom?" When you produced your notepad.
Yeah, that's it. He sort of sees the game and he wants to play the game. So somebody described him as like a Tony Soprano figure. There's a figure in the Sopranos where Tony there's a game of poker going on, and there's an old mafiosi guy who comes out of prison and he doesn't respect Tony and he doesn't laugh at his jokes. And Tony plays this back in his mind and thinks, I've got to get rid of this guy because he's not part of the team. And somebody that respects Boris, that there was an element of that about him. You know, he's using humor as a check, you know, to see, are these people on my side? So that's the kind of the darker side to it. The thing that I think people really dislike about it, and I think I've spoken to historians who know this sort of better than me, but these close resemblance to Disraeli, and this sense that every now and again politics throws up these figures that are that alien to our tradition in that we have often these sort of dour, quite moralistic politicians, straight-laced, who are sort of Gladstone then, or Blair, or Brown, Theresa May, these figures that are Thatcher, very much so, earnest figures who are sort of righteous. And then we have occasionally these figures who just see the absurdity of life and just poke fun at it, and poke fun at anybody who is too earnest. And Boris is that character. He's essentially taking the mick out of people who think there is anything to be serious about, in life. It's all a big show. So let's just take the mick. So I think I wonder whether, every now and again the country or politics requires a dose of that. Maybe in the US that comes in the form of somebody like Reagan, who just comes along and smiles and says, and I mean, he constantly used humor, didn't he?
Yes,
so maybe there's something.
But Reagan, and there is. I was just going to ask you in a second about the seriousness of the Boris project and what he's attempting to engineer. But I suppose with Reagan, there is and Boris Boris Johnson would absolutely hate me saying this. There is a seriousness in terms of him being a role model and a national role model to maybe it's just because it's the American head of state, and the American view of power is different. But Ronald Reagan in the 1980s or 70s or 1980s, that someone, a Republican, could say, yes, that's an archetype of an experienced American that you can aspire to. Boris isn't really aiming for that, is he? He's not aiming to be. There's no way that he would present himself as a kind of role model for life. Just on the seriousness of the project, because it gets to the heart of this question your piece does about what he's trying to achieve, and it's the project, as you put it, it's a kind of against declinism, or against effete elites who, as he sees it, have made our institutions in Britain just too downbeat about the prospects. Which the risk of that, as his opponents are saying, is that it's all very well to just say everything will be fine if you declare that it is, but then awkward reality gets in the way. But you seem to be quite persuaded by the idea.
So yeah, I think there is I don't know if it's adding the idea, on top of just the sort of the optimism and the sort of declaring your way out of a problem. That there is an semblance of a sort of structure now, or an idea of what Johnsonism is. I'm fascinated by the two sides of it. So I think belief and optimism do matter in politics, and they have a power. So I think changing the way people think about the country or the power of the institutions and can in itself create a sort of momentum. There is Reagan to some extent, Thatcher to some extent. They were able to re-energize the British establishment. Thatcher was able to re-energize the British establishment and say, change its culture for good or bad, whatever you think. She certainly did that. So I think there is something in that, but I also think it only goes so far, and this is the great challenge. Thatcher took extraordinarily difficult decisions that were extraordinarily divisive, and had real consequences for people's lives that last to this day. Johnson does not seem to me to have the grip and this kind of determination, ferocious determination and willingness to do those quite revolutionary things to the British economy. He talks
and he doesn't want to be unpopular. So to taking really difficult decisions. I suppose Brexit is a difficult decision, but beyond that, in terms of day-to-day management of the country, he wants to be popular mid-term, which Thatcher wasn't interested in.
Exactly. Thatcher had this self-righteous kind of drive. You know, the economics were an extension of morality in a way for her. Boris is not like that at all. You know, so you look at the levelling up agenda. It is it is a huge project. I would say, you know, that it's, you know, in many ways it's long overdue, but we are yet to sort of see how radical a proposal it needs to be. There are people who say, look, if you compare Britain now, what you really need to think of is kind of German reunification moment. You know, the difference between the North and the South in some respects is so vast that you need this massive transfers of wealth and infrastructure and all the rest, which is going to be incredibly unpopular in parts of the country. Now, I don't see anything resembling that in Johnson's program. I mean, who disapproves of more bus services in, you know, in Hartlepool or in Oldham, or of tram lines being put in Greater Manchester or Birmingham? Nobody disapproves of that. Nobody really disapproves of, you know, more factory jobs in the northeast, or nationalizing the airport in Teesside so that you can have a few more flights to Heathrow. These aren't great structural reforms of the British economy. Nothing has fundamentally shifted in the British economy. All the great power remains in London and the southeast, the great institutions, our hub airport. You know, so I think there is this fundamental sort of challenge at the heart of Johnson's project, between something that he gets at, which I think is true, about the need to be less sort of apologetic and to be more optimistic about what the country can do, because I think ultimately voters want that. They can't stand the kind of the depressive sort of dourness anymore, and a sense of momentum. Better move anywhere than nowhere at all, I think, was the lesson of 2016 to 2019. But is he sort of capable as a governor to actually do much, or are we going to have something similar to his mayoralty, which made people feel good in London, but ultimately left us with a cable car over the Thames, which nobody uses?
Final question. How long do you think he wants to be around for? Because prime ministers always end up becoming preoccupied with their legacy, and sometimes just the duration of the premiership. People want to set records. Do you see him as someone who's clearly now definitely going to fight the next election, but does he want to go on and on, or is there a limit to it, do you think?
I mean, I think his ego is pretty enormous, and I think he's going, like, you know, like most politicians, but I think he is in an incredibly strong position. My suspicion is he wants to go on and on. I think he would probably like to do something like Thatcher did. You know, it is within his grasp to run the country for the entire 2020s in the way Thatcher did in the 80s. You know, I think that's perfectly possible. If he came in 2019, Thatcher came in 79. You can see a situation where he wants to do something similar. So I remember in one part of the didn't make the piece because we were under sort of word constraint as ever. But I asked him, I asked him about this how long he wanted to stay in, essentially, and how big this project was. And he does this thing actually where he clocks a question, he parries it, and then it plays on his mind. And he came back to it at the end of the interview, and he said, "Look, what I'm saying, Tom, is that this project really is going to take a long time." And I said, "Well, how long?" And then he went back into his shell again. So I think he's got his eyes on the prize of a long premiership. But whether he's got the ability to sort of stay above water for that long, I don't know. I think there is that self-destructive element still.
We'll see. It's so interesting. Tom McTague of The Atlantic, thank you very much for joining us on Reaction. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction, it's very straightforward. Click subscribe on the screen to get more of these videos from us on YouTube, and also visit the main site, www.reaction.life, where you get all of the brilliant writing from the team, you get my weekly newsletter and lots more. Until next time, thank you very much.